Obviously, when we look at language development among ELL students, it's crucial that teachers have a sense of what is the progression, what are typical patterns. If they don't know what the typical patterns are, they may assume that just because a child has acquired reasonably good phonology in English or can speak it reasonably fluently in everyday context, that they've acquired English. And this was a major misconception earlier on. Back in the 70s and 80s, it was thought that after maybe 1 year in a bilingual program or 2 years or in an ESL program, when students had acquired a reasonable degree of fluency in everyday context in the language, that they had learned English. In actual fact, we know now that it takes a lot longer for students to catch up academically. So we have to make that distinction between conversational fluency in a language and academic language proficiency. When I first looked at this issue, I used the acronyms BICS and CALP. BICS stands for Basic Interpersonal Communicative Skills. CALP is Cognitive Academic Language Proficiency. Those terms or those acronyms are still widely used. But basically what they're getting at is the fact that everyday language is very different from academic language. Everyday language uses a relatively small set of high-frequency words. Academic language uses the full range of English vocabulary. There's a lot of words in academic language that students will come across in textbooks, in the content areas, particularly as they go up to grade levels, that we don't use in everyday contexts. So there's a difference in the lexicon or the vocabulary between everyday and academic language. Grammatically, we use just a relatively simple, straightforward set of grammatical structures in everyday language. In academic language, it's very common to have embedded sentences, relative clauses, the use of the passive voice, which we almost never use in everyday context. So that difference is an incredibly important difference to take account of, because if we don't do it, we may think, for example, that it's okay to test a student after 1 year of learning English. They seem like they've picked up English, and that student is going to typically perform very poorly on that test because they just haven't had enough time to catch up. There's still an expectation that students should be able to take tests in English and should have learned English after 1 year or 2 years. And this can be very demoralizing for teachers because their principals or administrators are expecting them to be able to enable students to catch up in that short amount of time. And basically, this is where the BICS-CALP distinction came from. The trajectory is very different for these two aspects of language. In terms of conversational fluency, typically ELL students will catch up or be able to function reasonably well within a year or two of exposure to English, but it takes a lot longer, at least 5 years, for students to catch up in terms of academic aspects. There's two reasons for that lengthier catch-up period. One is academic language is more complex than everyday language. We're using a much wider range of vocabulary. We're using different kinds of grammatical constructions. We're talking about reading and writing skills. But also, students are trying to catch up to a moving target. Native speakers of English are not standing still. Every year, they're making big gains in terms of vocabulary, in terms of reading skills, in terms of writing skills. So the ELL student has to run faster. And one of the reasons why it takes that length of time for them to catch up is because they're catching up to a moving target. If we're looking at the nature of academic language, we know that the vocabulary that is characteristic of academic language is not found in everyday conversation. We don't use that kind of conversation, that language with our friends. We find it in books. If students are not reading, they don't have the opportunity to gain access to that language. So they've got to be reading, they've got to want to read. So from the day a student walks into kindergarten, that student should be surrounded by books, they should be listening to stories, they should be acting out stories, they should be asked to, when the teacher is reading a story to students, she or he should stop and ask kids to think about what might happen next. There should be a lot of joy, a lot of fun connected to books. And I think that's something that we've forgotten about in reading policy over the last few years.
Sheltered instruction has been something discussed and written about in the field of bilingual ESL for many, many years. Now, in the past, what we have done was to remove English learners from their grade level content classes and provide them with intensive English instruction, but also delaying their content instruction until they reached a level of English proficiency that would enable them to be successful. Well, what we have learned over the years is we can no longer do that. These children cannot wait until they have English proficiency to learn content because they're not able to meet the grade level standards. They'll never catch up. So in the SIOP model, what we have done is to operationalize sheltered instruction through the 30 features and the 8 components of the model. But what so many people say is, well, the SIOP model is just good instruction. And we say, yes, it is, but whereas the 30 features in the SIOP model are certainly effective for all students, what is critically important for English learners is that we not only be focusing on our content standards, but also on developing language proficiency. So it is no longer just the purview of the English teacher and the ESL teacher to be responsible for developing language. Our math teachers, our history teachers, science, elementary teachers in all academic areas need to be looking at the academic language requirements of their subject areas and be focusing on how they can develop that language of their content as well as just general English knowledge.
Our students are not just learning the curriculum, they're also learning language, and that's something that a lot of teachers tend to forget, that we're teaching two things. And I think that may lead us into the notion of focusing in on those essential outcomes. By the end of the year, the students need to be accountable for this.
That's right.
So you may need to take out and weed out a lot of the unnecessary detail that our students do not need. I mean, they need to know what's essential and hold them accountable to that and build that language up.
Every day I write my students a letter, and in that letter they know what they're doing in reading, they know what they're doing in writing, and they know what they're doing in math. And I ask them, what are we doing today? What strategy are you learning today in reading? What strategy are you learning today in writing? What are we learning in writing? Okay, so they know. So by the end of the day on that learning post-it, I know that I should have one of those things written up there. So those objectives should be there.
And it's quick.
And it's quick.
And the other thing, if you follow, you've got the content objectives, which both bilingual teachers and mainstream teachers follow, but now language objectives. Language objectives for bilingual teachers are critical, and just as critical as your content, because we know what we're teaching them, but what language will they need to achieve this content objective? And it's something that through our staff developments for our bilingual teachers, it's been introduced and enforced and supported, because to a lot of us it's something new. And now that our school is following the SIOP model, it's a critical part of that. And the kids also need to understand that it's not enough to just be able to say, hey, how are you? in English. They need to be able to understand there's so much to the world of English that they need to know how to use it in school and across a domain. So the language objective is just as important, that they need to understand, okay, so today we're going to work with past tense to be able to explain or to retell something. And so that's just as critical.
I think language-wise, it would be easier for them to address that objective if they understood how many English language learners they have in their classroom that aren't being serviced. One teacher, the first day of school, she asked, how many of you speak another language at home or have a parent or someone at home that speaks another language? I think 80% of her students raised their hands. So she realized right then and there that, and only 4 of her students came to me. So she realized that most of her students were English language learners that are not being serviced. So I think if more teachers asked that question in the beginning of the year or the first day of school, they would address that language objective every day.
In the research literature on classroom interaction, it has been found that teacher talk occupies anywhere from 70 to 80% of all interactions in the classroom. And the other 20 to 30% of the time is shared among all the other students in the class. For English learners in the classroom, having to share the other 20% with all the other kids is not going to give very much time for these youngsters to acquire English. What we advocate and what we know from research is that we must provide a greater amount of time in which students are speaking with each other and interacting with the teacher and among themselves. Now, this will not happen unless teachers carefully plan lessons where students are interacting with each other throughout the lesson and throughout the day. One of the ways that teachers can promote interaction in the classroom is through incorporating a variety of activities that require cooperative learning. And by this, I don't mean just putting kids in groups, but really structuring discussion for them, having them be required to complete a task together in which they have to talk and work and share with each other, all builds interaction opportunities.
Linguistics is the scientific study of language, where we look at how it's organized on different levels. We can look at a sound system, the phonetics of language, or in a deaf community, we're looking at the sign language. So we may be looking at the organization of sounds or signs. Another level is how words are put together, commonly referred to as morphology, where we look at what kinds of structures go into words, how they're put together, certain kinds of inflectional morphemes or derivational morphemes. And then we're looking at syntax, how the words are organized into clauses, into sentences, in terms of both their order, in terms of their hierarchical relations to each other. Then we move up to semantics and pragmatics, the meaning and how language is used in a social context with intentions and so forth. So we say that language is modular in the sense that there are these levels of language that are operating at the same time that on one level seem to be independent of each other, but actually are integrated and make communication and language possible. When people learn about how words are put together or how sounds are structured or how signs are put together in terms of communication, it's really a rather imposing and awesome kind of reverence that we have for it, or at least I do. Suppose a young child comes into your classroom and she or he speaks a different language. If you know that there's a systematic sound difference that keeps that child from learning a particular English sound or a particular structure of words or syntax, that their language puts adjectives after nouns instead of in front of nouns. If you have that kind of information, then you can diagnose and really help the child to systematically get where they need to be in terms of their acquisition of English, their learning of language, and their use of language in a classroom setting. So linguistics is something that all content teachers need to know, whether it's math teachers, whether it's social studies teachers. It's not just language teachers who need to know about language.
There is a lot of diversity in our schools these days. What this means is that there are going to be many, many different patterns of behaviors that teachers will need to become familiar with. You can't learn, and there is to know about every cultural group in your classroom or in your school. What you can have, though, is an attitude of openness and willingness to learn about the children who are in your schools. Children will tell you how the world looks to them.
So some of you are right.
By their behavior.
You hear voices,
by their responses to you in many, many different ways. And what teachers should do or could do is to hone their skills in observation, and also to do a little bit of reading and to talk with adults.
When we're talking about the term intercultural competence, it's kind of the ability to know how to interact with people who come from different language backgrounds and different cultural groups. I think a critical piece of intercultural competence is knowing enough about your own culture so that you understand yourself, because a lot of the differences between groups may not be explicit differences. But the better you are about learning what you value, how you communicate within your own group, the more sensitive and aware you may become about how other people interact within their own group. A really important piece in terms of understanding cultures is to recognize the diversity within cultures. I think one of the problems in the way teachers traditionally used to be taught about culture meant that teachers generalize and maybe stereotype the ways they expected certain children to behave. Whereas when anthropologists now look at cultures, they look at diversity within and not just across different ethnic groups. And so it's really important for teachers to be aware of the fact that there might be a lot of diversity within the group of children that you have in your classroom, even if they're all considered to be part of one culture or one ethnic group. And so in terms of teachers learning about this, I think it's important for them to learn about the child and the family and the community in which the child is interacting, rather than to buy into some of the previous lists that used to be provided for teachers as to, Latinos or Hispanics are this way, or African Americans are this way, or Asian children are this way. Being aware of the fact that there is a lot of diversity within particular ethnic groups and cultural groups.
Because culture is so important, and because students bring with them cultural differences to the classroom, it's so important for teachers, for ESL teachers, for bilingual teachers, any teacher working with linguistically and culturally diverse students, to be aware, not just to be aware of the cultural differences, but to be aware of the importance of valuing those different ways of doing things that students are bringing with them to the classroom. And it's very hard for a lot of teachers because culture is something we don't usually think about, and how culture defines who we are and defines how we process our environment, how we interact with others. But we have to base all of our teaching and to create in our classrooms an environment that not just is aware of cultural differences, but genuinely values the different ways that different cultures bring with them to the classroom. And so not to set aside the fact that some students may feel that it's immodest to show bare arms, for example, in a school setting, and to value that for what it's worth. And really, cultural diversity, to me as a teacher at least, is a source of great enrichment for everyone. It is so much more exciting to have different cultures represented in my classroom than to have just one or two cultures represented in my classroom.
And your turkey paper and a pencil. And then I'm going to count to 5 and see who's ready to cut the mic roll. 1. Uh-oh. I didn't ask you to come over here. Gotcha. And your listening manners. 2. Better. Thank you. 3. 4. And 5. 1. Just stop what you're doing right now. And I will ask New to help you find it. All right? Okay, table 4, come on over to the carpet. New, will you help Juan find his 4? So I thought we'd start with our turkey song. What do I have right here?
Turkey.
What is the word right here?
Turkey.
Turkey. Let's spell it.
Turkey.
That spells turkey. Are you ready for our song?
Yes.
Here we go. I know a bird that goes gobble gobble, and turkey is its name. Turkur, Tur. I wonder if this is a storybook or nonfiction. That's telling us real things about turkeys. I think that's a better way to say that. What do you think? Is it a story? Is it fiction? Or is it real things about turkeys? Nonfiction. Nonfiction? Let's take a look and see what we can find out about turkeys. See if you're right. See if I'm right. Turkeys on the farm. Turkeys are farm animals. Most farm turkeys are large birds.
No, we need to do the thinging.
We need to give you a chance to color it. You're
And
right.
we need to label it.
We definitely need to label it. So let's get ready to do that.
And we need to write it.
Absolutely. So show me that you're ready to do that. What do first grade listeners look like when they are ready to work? Thank you. Labeling our drawing is going to help us have the words that we need to be able to write everything we want to say about turkeys today. So, having drawn our picture already, I looked at our book right here, and I can see that it already has an illustration with labels in it for us. Look at this part of the turkey right here. What do you think that label might say? Well, right here where my finger is. I see it. I'm going to use a lowercase t. It's not going to be very interesting because I don't have any describing words yet. So I'm going to go back and do one more thing to help my writing be more exciting. I want to add a describing word to each one of these. What kind of a tail do you think turkeys have?
Colorful tail.
Ah, I like that word, colorful. Could you use another word instead of colorful?
Pretty. Beautiful tail.
Pretty. Beautiful. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. For writing, it's time to get down to the important writing job. Are you ready? All right. First, I have to give my piece of writing, my describing piece of writing, a title. I think I'll tell about ice cream today.
Okay.
Is that what my plan is?
No.
No? All right, I guess I'm writing about pumpkins today. No? Santa Claus?
No.
What am I writing about today? What's my plan, Lupita?
Write about turkey.
I'm writing about turkeys today, so what should my title be then?
The turkey.
Turkeys. This is the title, the name of my paragraph.
That's the name.
So I think I'm going to say turkeys are...
Pretty.
You want to say pretty?
Yeah.
All right, we can say turkeys are pretty. I know that you've had a busy day today, and it's time for you to show me what good writers do when they're writing. Remember, start with a topic sentence. And you guys follow her with your eyes. Did she find topic sentences?
Yes.
Did you see this? Okay. So what are you going to do with the word first? Okay, I think that's a good idea. Good thing you read it again. Good for you. Say to everyone that I did see some hard work going on. I did see some careful spelling going on. And I can see that you had things to say about turkeys today. What I'm looking for today when we're sharing is people that use their writing plan, their picture that we labeled. I'm looking for people who use their writing plan, remember to put a topic sentence, some details that tell more about what they're writing about, and a conclusion, so that when you finish your paragraph, you have a beginning, a middle, and an end to your paragraph.
But let me tell you about turkeys. First, turkeys have orange beaks. Next, they have soft feathers. Last, they have colorful tails. All in all, turkeys are so cool.
I liked your topic sentence. And I liked the details that you were telling about.
Diana, I noticed that you start reading and writing workshop in your first grade classroom almost at the very beginning of the year. I have first grade teachers telling me constantly, oh, you can't do reading and writing workshop in first grade. You know, they're not ready for it. How do you get them moving in this direction so early in the year?
I think with the concept that if they can say it, they can write it. And if they can write it, they can read it. And they see me modeling by reading a good book and doing some writing activity with it right away. And so they begin to see the connection between the reading and writing tasks early on. And I give them journals to begin with at the beginning of the year and encourage them right from day one to begin to respond in some way to whatever book that I'm reading with them or sharing in the classroom. And so I may do a read aloud right there on day one and then have them go back to their desks and think about a part of the book that they liked and just begin with a simple picture. And from there we begin to attach labels, and from there we begin to move into constructing complete sentences until finally at the end of the year they're able to write some pretty sophisticated responses in literature response journals, and in terms of their personal connection to whatever story has been read to them or that they've read themselves, or they'll make connections between stories and compare one story to another in terms of the reading workshop. In Writer's Workshop, we begin very early with interactive writing, and they once again connect that writing task to speech and being able to read, and they turn around and they begin to attempt and approximate in their journals as well the writing task. And we take the time to celebrate what they have written, and so they begin to see themselves as authors right away. And we just begin to add pieces of the writing process throughout the year until they are writing and publishing their own books for the classroom.
Talk a little bit about how you get them to revise, because that's very difficult for first graders. I've noticed you use a sample of their writing and really walk them through the process.
Absolutely, because quite often if you ask a first grader to revise without a lot of modeling going on, they'll take that piece of writing back to their desk and bring it back to you as a totally newly written piece. And so they need to see that the task that's being asked of them in revision is polishing the message of their writing. They're making their writing more clear, and it may be taking out a word or adding a word into the writing or moving words around to make their message more clear. And I quite often will ask the children if I may use a piece of their writing, and I'll duplicate it on sentence strips in a pocket chart and cut the sentences apart, and we'll use sentence strips to rearrange those sentences or lengthen them to make the message once again more clear. So they begin to see the revision process as not making a whole new piece of writing, but polishing what they had and making their meaning more clear.
So you actually introduce each stage of the writing process, and you model it and you practice it so that they truly understand what's involved in each step.
Absolutely. And we focus at the beginning on the pre-writing stage, getting ready to write, making a plan for writing. And for us, that planning stage is quite often drawing. And it gives them something concrete to respond to or to think about and then tell about in their writing. Quite often we'll label their illustrations as well, because that will also provide them a little word bank right on the paper in front of them from which to draw when they're writing And also, we look at taking those labels and then turning them into those complete sentences. So we begin with the idea of a topic sentence. And once we've established that idea of a topic sentence informing the reader of what the writer is going to be writing about, then we can go on and add some transitional words of first, next, and last. So by the end of the year, we will have moved through the topic sentence and supporting details.
Findings that has emerged very strongly from the cognitive psychology literature is the fact that learning involves building on students' prior knowledge. You could define learning, in fact, as linking up new information and skills with what the student already knows. And so that prior knowledge is a crucial aspect. We've got to take steps to bridge the gap between the student's background knowledge, their cultural knowledge, and what's happening in the classroom. That means that on a regular basis, students should be brainstorming about what they know about a particular topic. They should be bringing in what they've learned from their parents, what they've read from books in their first language. All of that is important. So it's not just a matter of transmitting a curriculum. We've got to link that curriculum with what students have in their heads. And that's a very different process than just filling out the blanks or clicking off the objectives that have been met. Learning is a two-way process. It's not just going from the teacher to the student. It's linking up what the student knows with what the teacher is trying to teach. An implication here is that students' first languages are important.
Today, teachers have to be much more concerned about the language skills that these students bring to classrooms, the background knowledge they bring to classrooms, the experiences.
It's interesting to have a class with kids from other countries because some kids have had very little formal schooling and some kids have had very rigorous academic training in the schools in their native language. So you have a wide variety of educational backgrounds. That added to the language barrier, it makes it a very interesting mix. I think that students in such a diverse population have a lot of support available to them because there are still students who speak their native language. They're seeing their culture in after-school activities. They're seeing their culture in the classroom. And I think that can be very helpful in making them more comfortable and helping ease the transition.
To be able to provide responsive instruction and meet the needs of these English learners presents a tremendous challenge to teachers because language and identity are so closely bound and because identity is especially important, I think, to adolescents. They're trying to figure out who they really are. The special challenge teachers have is to build skills and competence, but at the same time honor the diversity. In honoring diversity, we have the opportunity to create some relevance and meaningful context for students to actually develop competence with language. But it is going to take special work. It's going to take special attention.
Understanding a student's background as far as what support do they have at home and in what areas, how are their parents or guardians able to help them, and where might we also help their family, because the families want to support their students. They sometimes don't have the tools to be able to do that.
We mediate experience with language. That is, we think about, remember, translate, interpret what happens in our everyday lives with language. And since experience defines who we are, then language also defines who we are. When individuals and students come to the United States who have limited English proficiency, we can't fully appreciate who they are because they're not using their mother tongue. Language and identity.
For each of us, there is a system of knowledge that we learn in the socialization process growing up in our families. The rules of how to interact with people, rules that govern the way we look at the world. We are influenced, though, by the experiences we have had. You notice that when people interact with young children, they'll say, well, did you have a good time? Was that pretty? Isn't that nice? And all of that, all of these little interactions add up for children as a kind of framing of experiences. This includes values, knowledge, ways of framing experiences, ways of taking from experiences, which is to say, ways to learn. So our behaviors, our practices, the way we think, the way we feel, even how close we can stand to other people if we know them well, as opposed to not know them. How we see ourselves in relation to the others in our world, older than us, younger than us, same age, same background, etc., etc. All of that is a part of our culture.
Within the SIOP model, we make a very clear distinction between instructional strategies and learning strategies. Instructional strategies are those techniques and methods and approaches and activities that you do in the classroom. Such things as cooperative learning, the author's chair, all those different kinds of things that we use to enrich our teaching. When we talk about learning strategies, we're talking about the kinds of strategic thinking that youngsters do and adults do when we are reading and when we are learning. Just because students are not proficient English speakers does not mean that they cannot be good thinkers. We cannot wait until they have acquired a level of English proficiency that enables them to think actively within the language before we start teaching these very important cognitive and metacognitive strategies to them. The cognitive strategies that good learners use include such things as the ability to underline important information, to fill out good graphic organizers and structure information in that manner, to be able to know when you need to go back and reread, or to be able to hone in on important key vocabulary. This list is pretty long in terms of all these different things that good learners do to help themselves. Metacognitive strategies include being able to make good predictions, to be able to see that there's a difference in how we predict narrative text as opposed to expository text, to know when self-questioning will help you be able to understand very challenging text, the ability to clarify, to monitor your comprehension when reading. One of the most challenging aspects of expository text for students and adults alike is to figure out what's really important here. So determining importance and evaluating very important metacognitive strategies. Summarizing and synthesizing, being able to use visualization to help you picture something as you read can help you monitor and be able to comprehend better. So it's very, very important that while English learners are learning the language, teachers are teaching these cognitive and metacognitive strategies to them as well as to the rest of the students in the class.
Remember last time we worked on nonfiction, you got a chance to choose which assignment you wanted to do. But before we get to that point, I just want you to work as a group to help you remember how to do your power outlining, okay, which was a CRIS strategy that we've learned for best practices that are used to understand what's going on in the textbook. So I'm going to leave 3 sheets of paper.
Project CRIS is a compilation of several strategies that research has shown work best to improve student learning. We adapted it because we found it works for the students that are reading on the 3rd grade level through 12th grade level. So it can be adapted or modified as well as far as improving the student learning across the curriculum.
Okay, if you were doing a power, we're going to do this power outlining first. Power outlining, your number 1. What would be next to your number 1 and why?
The main idea, like the title of the form.
Okay, that's the only number 1. Okay, so instead of having Roman numerals, we have numbers, and we've learned that through the CRIS strategies, creating independence through student-owned strategies, that we write a number 1 down because that's going to represent the main idea. So put a number 1.
Repetition is very important throughout each quarter, 1st, 2nd, 3rd quarter, throughout the entire school year. Because if it gets cold, they'll forget, and I want them to be able to transfer those skills across the content areas. I started out with the power outlining that I started with the very first quarter. With the power outlining, it does deal with organizational skills, and it's awful helpful with writing a paper too. But instead of trying to remember Roman numerals, it puts the focus upon the content of what they're reading, where they're able to pull out the main idea and look for details rather than being stuck on a number.
I want to show where, just like you did last time, you had a choice of whether to draw the power map
or do the power outline or a summary. The end, when we finish today's class, we're going to do that again. With power mapping, the shape and the color is what dictates what number it is. So let's say if the student chose to make a box for the main idea, that would be number 1. And there's no other shape that has the same size and shape as that box that was drawn for the main idea. Number 2s are a totally different shape and color. So you can recognize at a glance, a visual type of thing, which one is the main idea, which one are subtopics, which ones are details. Some people learn better visually in terms of the organization, the spatial. Other people learn better in a linear fashion, verbally. They can see from 1 through 10 what it is they have to do. The students themselves choose the best learning method for them to be successful.
If you have students included in a general ed classroom and they don't understand the content, you're kind of wasting the entire effort. So making sure that they understand the content through whatever instructional modifications you use is really what you're trying to do with Inclusive Kids.
Clockwise is that way.